Autopsy doctors of Reddit. What was the biggest revelation you had to a person's death after you carried out the procedure? Assisted with a post-mortem when I was a student. Female patient died in her 40s. Her medical history had extensive complaints of abdominal pains. One doctor even referred to her as a hypochondriac and others commented on apparent anxiety. Opened her abdomen, and she had extensive scar tissue. She was absolutely massacred inside from endometriosis. She suffered for decades and never got referred for a laparoscopy. She didn't have freaking anxiety. She had a medical condition. A few clarifications. Patient cause of death was unrelated. I won't give any details because it may get too identifying. I'm UK based and this was an NHS post-mortem. Patient did not have diagnosed anxiety. Doctors referred to her anxiety only in relation to her abdominal pain complaints. No other known history. When my parents were in medical school, they attended an autopsy of a patient who had died in a car accident. Autopsy revealed that apparently this guy had survived a chest shot in Vietnam years ago that the surgeon/medics left in rather than perform risky surgery. The accident had migrated the bullet to his heart and was ruled the cause of death. Not mine, but a doctor I used to work with back when he was in school. He would do his cadaver labs really late at night. To many people during the day. One time it was really late. Around 2 AM. He was listening to his lecture on his headphones and he saw the cadaver's arm move/twitch. He thought it was just his mind playing tricks on him. Then he saw it again. Proceeded to run away in a panic. He told a few of his classmates what happened but nobody believed him. Next day they had a group cadaver lab with the same cadaver. The arm twitched yet again. The professor did some digging, and it turns out the patient's pacemaker was still fully functional and occasionally fired, causing the arm twitch. He was so relieved. He thought there was a zombie in there. I may be late to the party, but I finally have a good story to tell. In medical school, my group's cadaver was an 80-plus-year-old female who was extremely unfit, morbidly obese with muscles half the size of any other cadavers. Her pectoral muscles were paper thin. To get some reference, we figured she was bedridden during her last few months, which would somewhat explain these findings. When we started on urology unit and began to dissect the infratemporal fossa, I discovered a small metal pellet under the skin behind her right ear. My tankmates and I went on to find dozens of these metal pellets strewn around her head's anatomy, with some lodged into the cranium and others in the bones of her face. We contacted her living relatives to get some clarification and they ended up revealing that when this lady and her brother were children, they said she was 8 years old. They were playing with an old decorative rifle that the family had mounted above the fireplace. Long story short, the brother accidentally discharged the rifle into the girl's face. The aftermath was this lady was blind and wheelchair bound for the rest of her life, and the pellets weren't all removed. It was an interesting dissection with that information from then on, but a sobering moment in reminding our class that our cadavers are humans with their own struggles and rich lives. If you're considering donating your body to science, please know that we don't take the responsibility lightly, and a million thanks aren't enough. My friend once cremated a lady, and when they pulled the table out there were 3 sets of forceps sitting there. Most likely she died in surgery, but I always thought it was crazy those were left in, and whatever metal they are made of clearly has a higher melting point than cremation temps. My friend had to do an autopsy on a baby. The dad claimed she died after rolling off a couch. My friend found that the kid was slammed against a hard surface multiple times. Dad eventually admitted he hit the baby against the wall after she wouldn't stop crying. My friend had to quit that job cause it was so taxing mentally. Masters in forensic pathology here. You'd be surprised to know the number of people that have life-threatening issues that never went diagnosed and that they didn't die from. Seen an older guy who died of pneumonia in hospital. On autopsy the guy had both an enlarged heart and a couple of medium-sized aneurysms in the brain. Another guy in his roughly 70s apparently came into the ER and had chest pain then died shortly after. Dies of a heart attack, but also had cancer. In less natural circumstances though, saw a guy who had been shot in the head a couple of times. 3 definite entries and a blown out skull, but police only found 1 bullet. Couldn't find the other bullet in his head at all. Assumed the police missed it. Went on as normal with the autopsy until we got to the chest cavity. The other bullet was just chilling beside his lung. Turns out it entered the skull, hit the inside, ricocheted down his neck, and into the chest. That was pretty wild. I'm a veterinarian and sometimes I do necropsy, basically autopsy for animals, and one of the more notable case involved a prized Wagyu cow that died mysteriously. Wagyu cows are very expensive to rear and fetch a good price at the slaughterhouse. After cutting her open, I found metal wires extending from her stomach into her heart. It's what we call hardware disease. Apparently the cow decided that eating metal wires for constructing fences was a good idea. Normally the farmhands are quite good at keeping these hazards away from the inquisitive bovines, but I guess slip-up do happen from time to time. Not exactly an autopsy per se, but it was a patient found unresponsive, with CPR in progress by EMS. The man was clearly homeless, based on his appearance and smell. He reportedly had not been seen for several days by his friends, and was eventually found behind a fast food restaurant dumpster. We were briefly able to get a pulse back, and when the nurse cut his pants off to place a catheter we saw the cause. He had fashioned some sort of makeshift cock ring out of the neck of a plastic bottle. It was way too tight and completely cut off the circulation. The peen was fully black and necrotic. I did a bedside ultrasound and found his abdomen full of free fluid, which is bad. Most likely his bladder had ruptured from being unable to urinate for days. His lab suggested he was in septic shock and full-blown renal failure as well. He did not survive much longer than that. I remembered another one. In my final year of training we had a cadaver lab to practice advanced airway management techniques, for instance, difficult intubation, cricothyroidotomy, etc. While I was helping an intern do a basic intubation, she commented the tube wouldn't pass. I think she has some kind of growth or mass in her airway. I took a look, asked for some forceps, and pulled a half-eaten hot dog out of her larynx. It of course had been embalmed along with the rest of her. Cause of death identified. My wife is a pathologist assistant, and during her schooling carried out the autopsy of a newborn that died minutes after birth. The mother was desperate for a child, and had a history of multiple miscarriages at different terms. This was her first time making it full term and all prenatal checkups revealed no problems. The delivery was difficult, but successful, and baby was alive for a short time. Skip to autopsy. All signs point to baby being fully developed. Get to the abdominal cavity and the liver is lacerated and hemorrhage everywhere. During the difficult delivery the resident used too much force with the forceps to pull the baby out. The ruptured liver that caused the baby to bleed out internally. Wife was enthusiastic about autopsy up to this point. Now has no interest. Sheep farmer. I have to know how to do a necropsy for when something dies to know if it's something that could spread. Had a ewe fall over dead after losing a ton of weight, and after treating her for everything under the sun. She would gasp for air and struggled to breathe, but antibiotics, steroids and anti-inflammatory drugs didn't touch it. She finally passed away, and I cut her open to see what the hell happened, fully expecting to see her lungs riddled with crap. Her heart was 5 times the normal size and hard as a river stone. My guess is she'd had that issue her whole life, and it didn't kill her until she was 2. My dad used to perform autopsies. His best story was that they would brought a body that has no real indication of any issues. After examining the body, the only thing of note was that there was blood coming out of the guy's rectum. They begin the autopsy and the guy's organs are completely liquefied, and the body cavity is filled with lead shot. It became apparent really quickly that someone had shoved a shotgun up his ass and pulled the trigger. This was in the 70s, and I still have to wonder what this guy did to piss someone off enough to get a shotgun up his ass. A body came in with a gunshot wound to the chest. There was no exit wound. They tried to locate the bullet during the autopsy. No success. They then did a whole scan, X-ray or CORT, of the upper chest / abdomen / pelvis. No bullet point. At that point someone said, frick it, let's scan the whole body. Lo and behold, the bullet was detected in the popliteal fossa area behind the knee. It had embolized / traveled from the heart all the way down the arterial system to the knee, where it got stuck in one of the narrower blood vessels. Training in the medical examiner's office. Elderly woman found dead by herself in her home. There was nothing suspicious, so I was given the case. Took out all the organs. Dissected everything. Completely unremarkable. I cut through the larynx as a last step, before I could clean up and finish the case, and boom. Giant piece of chicken lodged in her windpipe. Died choking on dinner. In college I took a figure drawing class, and the teacher was adamant that you couldn't draw the figure if you didn't know what was in it. So he dragged us over to the anatomy lab and had the anatomy teacher show us 2 cadavers that were being dissected by their med students. When it came time to ask questions, of course, have you ever found something weird in a body, came up. The story is as follows. They get a body, and for legal reasons they aren't told much about the person aside from medical history. They were told that the old man was a sort of rock star type and was a one-hit wonder from his youth, and to use extra discretion with him in particular / not tell the students who might recognize him. The lab is full of 20-year-olds, and so nobody recognized who he was, unsure if the teacher even knew, but it didn't sound like she did, or what his deal was, so they wrote it off as non-useful information aside from his lifestyle. He had drug use and alcohol issues in his life, and they were told he partied a lot. Cool. The body has a raging boner, like 100% of the time. Teacher doesn't think much of it aside from that he was particular endowed, and everybody wrote it off as not important to their studies. So they go through the general dissection that they do. One kid wants extra credit and the teacher said sure. Dissect his peen/see why it's hard still, and write a report. Apparently they don't normally do that for that particular class, so the peen itself goes into shade from their dissections, so it would have otherwise always been a mystery. Kid finds an actual rod that he had medically inserted under the table, not in medical records, so that he would always have a boner and could get it up while on drugs. They suspected was done over 30-40 years prior to his death. They removed it and keep it in the lab, I believe, to show their students as part of a section on under the table medical surgeries. Anyways, that was probably the best day in figure drawing class I've ever had. I did the autopsy of both a robber and his victim. The robber shot the victim in the back when he tried to escape in a motorcycle, and the robber was shot by the police in the exact same situation. What's interesting is that they both died by exactly the same lesion. Both of them had their 4th lumbar vertebra shattered and their aorta, main artery of the body, sectioned at the same level. I thought of it like an extreme example of instant karma. I'm a pre-med student, and one time, while shadowing a forensic pathologist, 3 days before Christmas, he was doing an autopsy on an automobile vs pedestrian accident. The man's face was completely smashed in. When they take samples of the brain, they cut the skin, pull it over the face, and the cut off the top of the skull. When they did that, the skull was basically shattered and bone fragments pulled back with the skin, and when they cut off the skull cap, the brain was obviously damaged, and the eyeballs had been pushed back / fallen through the orbits and into the cranial cavity. The guy also had $10,000 in cash in his jean pockets. According to police, he had a record involving drugs, so the theory was either a drug deal gone bad, or he stumbled into the road while under the influence. I worked at a coroner's office for a while, and once we had a guy who we thought had died from an OD on meth. Well, we started the autopsy and I went to cut his lungs out, and blueberry muffin mix started coming out of them. I stuck my finger in his mouth, and it was full of blueberry muffin mix, and it was in throat. Turns out he got just high enough to pass out while eating the muffin mix, and he ended up choking to death. Not a doctor, but a whole body scientific donation technician. I'm the person who dissects cadavers after they were donated. We very commonly would get young cases, normally overdoses. Had a mid-30s female, went to medical examiner prior to donation, but they only did an external evaluation. I went to check her genitals to see if I could palpate a uterus. Found a condom full of pills. Similar to most. The body became a crime scene and we couldn't touch her. When we finally were able to continue, they asked us to photograph the pills to send to the examiner's office. They were mostly Advil and Zyrtec. Easily one of the weirdest things I've ever found. Forensic pathologist here. To come to mind, I had just moved back to my home state where family lives. Get a case with a man with a distinctive last name in the family tree. I put a text out to my mom to see if we were related, but before she texted back I pulled the sheet back and already knew he looked like me. It was my great uncle. Get a case where it's a house fire death. On exam he's got multiple textbook stab and incised wounds. I spend the next 30 minutes getting gaslighted, quizzed by PD about are you sure? Because they thought this was a straightforward house fire. UN fun fact, fire's not an uncommon way for people to try to conceal a homicide. My high school science teacher was a coroner, or whatever, and one day was asked to perform an autopsy on a little girl who was shot by a shotgun. He quit on the spot. He was an absolutely fantastic teacher. Worked at an animal hospital. They did necropsies for zoos all the time. An alligator died, and they shipped it to the hospital, refrigerated etc to stop the decay. They took it out and put it up on the table. After doing all the paperwork, they started opening up the alligator. After the first cut, the alligator opened its eyes. Turns out it wasn't dead. The zoo vet mistook an illness for death and the low temperature put it basically into a coma. Edit. Unfortunately this is all the information I know on this story. It's been 7 years since I worked at that place. During my internship rotation a couple of years back, a 40-year-old guy came in because he suddenly collapsed while drinking with friends. He came in unresponsive, mouth bleeding, and not breathing. So we had to intubate him. For some reason, the endotracheal tube, the stiff tube placed inside the trachea to help the patient breathe, won't go in. But we managed to suction copious amounts of blood clots. After CPR, still with unsuccessful intubation, so we had to back him with a face mask. The patient was declared dead and diagnosed with a ruptured abdominal aortic aneurysm. During the autopsy, they found out that the guy was apparently shot by a gun from the top of the head. The entry wound was obscured by his hair and was barely bleeding at all. And the bullet somehow went through the back of the guy's throat and made a hole behind the base of the tongue, which the endotracheal tube kept slipping into. Late to the thread, so this will probably get buried. Disclaimer, I'm a doctor, but not an autopsy doctor, and had never really considered pathology as a specialty when I was in medical school. This event happened in anatomy lab when I was in medical school. In the preclinical years of medical school, most medical schools have students enroll in anatomy lab where we dissect cadavers as part of the course. One of the anatomy labs had a cadaver who had passed away from complications from kidney failure, according to the identification tab. While that anatomy team was dissecting some of the leg and buttock muscles, they found a bullet in the gluteus medius. No idea how it got there and totally unrelated to the cause of death. I like to imagine the guy signing paperwork to donate his body to science, thinking that the med students dissecting his blood would get a funny surprise. My grandmother had a massive stroke in her 30s that paralyzed her entire left side, and died in her 60s from a heart attack. But while doing the autopsy they found out she had bad lung cancer, but she never had any pain from it because it was in her left lung. She was a very heavy smoker, so it made sense. It's just crazy that she had lung cancer and never knew. Medical examiner here. This probably isn't a big wow revelation, but it certainly made an impact on me. Very early in my career, I did an exam on another doctor who worked at the hospital where I trained. I didn't know this gentleman personally, but was acquainted with him by reputation. He was a very happy-go-lucky sort, much loved by everyone in his department. He died unexpectedly at a young age of what turned out to be a drug overdose on pharmaceuticals he had been diverting from the hospital. I don't think anybody saw that coming, myself included. It was a lesson to me that anybody can fall victim to addiction, and that it's hard to know what anybody's private struggles are. Not an autopsy doctor, but did take anatomy and physiology second with lab in college. The lab was working on cadavers being prosecuted by more advanced students. A prosection is the dissection of a cadaver, human or animal, or part of a cadaver by an experienced anatomist in order to demonstrate for students anatomic structure. Anyway, one of the cadavers, we had a male and a female for obvious reasons, was a big ol' Linebacker looking dude, like, and older bodybuilder type. I like his age at time of death was late 50s. His heart has been removed by the anatomist, and we were examining it because it was very enlarged and contributed to his death. We all had to hold it in our hands to feel the heft, like size and weight, and compare it to the heft of the female's heart, which was normal sized. about like a large apple. The male's heart, for comparison, was the size of a small cantaloupe. I went first, for whatever reason, and the instructor lifted the enlarged heart out of its preservative bath and placed it in my hands. I damn near dropped the thing when it shocked me with what felt like a jolt of electricity. I, understandably, I think, made a startled noise, and the instructor took the heart back before I could juggle it onto the floor. "Oh," she said, "I forgot to warn you. Look out for the passamaker." Apparently when someone has a passamaker there's a battery too, and they don't bother taking it out/off. They just snip the leads and leave it there. So if you touch both bare leads you get a mild shock, even through your exam gloves. That was a mildly disturbing experience. I'm a med student, not a pathologist or coroner, but in anatomy lab the tank next to me had a donor with an inflatable peen pump inside his scrotum and shaft. It was completely self-contained. Fluid in the container in the scrotum could be pumped into the shaft tube creating an erection. Then the fluid would just be released back into the pump and the boner would go away. Pretty wild. I'm a former police officer and attended several autopsies to record info for investigation files. One guy had been shot and killed, so the cause of death was pretty plain. But the pathologists doing the autopsy found a tumor the size of a walnut on his brainstem. He said the guy would have been dead in a few months, even if he hadn't been shot. Another guy was dead due to a steak knife being stabbed through his heart by his wife. She claimed she grabbed the knife because she was scared he was going to kill her, and when he lunged at her the knife just went in. But when the doctor pointed out a half dozen or so marks that looked like freckles around the wound, he swabbed to develop a solution that clearly showed they were tiny little poke marks. I was able then to get her to confess that he was goading her. Go ahead, do it until she hauled off and kabobbed him. It's not always like TV shows where the autopsy is the aha moment that solves a case, but sometimes it really is. My auntie is a coroner, and she was told to expect nothing more than a gunshot wound to a pregnant female, which is what it was, but the bullet had killed the woman, a 9-month developed baby who had the bullet pass through and end up in the palm of its hand like it was holding it. I was a forensic tech for a state medical examiner's office for about 2 years. I've assisted in about 1,000 autopsies and have removed bodies from scenes from likely twice that. I told these stories in another AskReddit thread about people who clean up crime scenes, and I have a few takeaways. 1. Man who had a psychotic break and castrated himself and stuffed it all into this mouth before cutting his own throat. 2. Man who was sodomized to death with a broom, a baseball bat, and the tuning end of a guitar. 3. Man who decapitated himself by hanging himself with high tension cable and jumping off a bridge. 4. Woman overdosing whilst carrying an 8-month pregnancy. No really any major revelations like, in terms of something wild unexpected, or a medical finding that contradicts the police report. Just seen enough crap in one lifetime for 100 people. Totally not related but somewhat related, my sister-in-law works in medicine, and one of her classes involved studying and dissecting cadavers. One day in class they wheeled in a body, and when they pulled back the sheet, a girl fainted when she realized it was her aunt. I'm a medical student, not a doctor, but when I dissected my cadaver in my first year, it had lots of surgical markings and was pretty overweight. After I'd been able to work through all the parts of the body with my group, we were able to piece together with our lab leader that our donor had been in and out of the hospital for a quadruple bypass, followed by a passamaker, a stomach stapling, and then what looked like an emergency open heart surgery that she died during. Not a rare disease or strange occurrence per se, but it was interesting finding clues around the body as we learned anatomy. Medical student here, and this story is from anatomy class. One of the cadavers in our class died of cancer, and when we took out the gentleman's liver it was very large and full of bumps all over. The liver itself was also hard as a rock. The poor man's cancer had spread all over his liver and was full of tumors. It really hit home that this was what cancer was like and demonstrated its pure destructive nature. The word you are looking for is coroner or medical examiner. Not a doctor, but I did a necropsy on one of my birds a couple weeks ago. I couldn't tell how she died before it happened, but after opening her up I found about 14 masses of tissue in her reproductive system. At first I thought it was cancer from dissecting one of the masses. Later I found out it was actually an intestinal infection. Not a forensic pathologist or me, but I occasionally liaised with an office as part of local print media in the aughties. Many fascinating stories. But the one that stuck with me, no pun intended, was from an me who discovered, while dissecting a man's heart, that he had killed himself by first heating peanut butter to a liquid and then injecting it. It reached his heart and clogged it up. And that's an image my brain still loves to dwell on now and then. I'm not a doctor, but my dad was a police officer, and once a reporter came to the lab and my father was escorting her. She watched a full autopsy. But when my father started eating his sandwich it gave a loud crack and poor lady thought that the body made the sound and threw up in the middle of the autopsy. As someone who is waiting on autopsy results from the coroner on a loved one, I find this incredibly fascinating and frightening at the same time. Med student almost graduated here. A couple years ago I attended the pathological anatomy course, and during a class the professor showed us some autopsies. Despite the tremendous smell of 4/5 consecutive autopsies, one of them was carried out on a homeless patient that died in the air probably due to heart failure. The body had massive ascites, flared in the abdomen. So at first he had to evacuate it. Imagine him cutting the abdomen and the yellow rancid liquid started to come out like a fountain. One of my colleagues fainted. Then the next step was to examine the abdominal organs. Imagine the face of every person in the room when it became clear that the patient had some form of inherited polycystic disease and the liver and the kidneys were full of cysts. The liver weighted more than 10 kilograms, normal weight 2-3 kilograms, and the kidneys almost 3 kilograms each, normally 150 g each. The professor was really shocked at the beginning, but then he really enjoyed cutting through the cysts in order to get samples. They popped like air balls spreading liquid all over the place. Second colleague fainted. The other ones were pretty standard. But I think I will remember forever this one. In particular that liver on the scale. I even took a picture, but I can't find it anymore. Not me, but I read a story of a guy that drank antifreeze because he was freezing to death and it actually worked for a bit before he died a terrible death from the antifreeze. I'm just going to save this one for later and hope it blows up. I was in charge of making copies of all evidence to be used in the trial of Donald Harvey in 1989. He was known as the Angel of Death. One bit of evidence was an autopsy photo of an exhumed elderly woman. The examiner was holding with tweezers an 18-inch piece of cotton being pulled from her throat. Harvey liked to stuff cotton so far down into the victims' throats that it could not be seen. I still can't shake the image from my brain. There was this girl my mum grew up with on an army base. She had a really long plait she used to chew on in her sleep, and she choked to death on a hairball once. Apparently it was the size of a kiwi fruit lodged in her throat. My mom loves this story. My aunt got accepted into nursing school, but had to get prerequisites done in the summer. She knew someone who pulled some strings, and she was put into a pre-med class that taught pretty much the same thing as one of her nursing classes. She was the only woman, and because she has always looked younger than she is, and she was only 20 to begin with, and she's really pretty, all the pre-med students groaned and complained that she would hold the class back. Anyway, time came for the cadaver lab. The decedent had been in a car accident. The lab director and professor kept telling them that they weren't looking for a cause of death, it had already been determined, they were just looking at the anatomy. My aunt was looking over the x-rays and asked, what were the circumstances of the accident? My grandpa was a firefighter/paramedic, so she knew that was a huge thing. The professor is like, we are not looking for the cause of death. We told you. It was trauma from a car accident. My aunt responds, there's a small spot on his kidney right here on the x-ray. They went and checked the kidney, and sure enough, there was a tiny tumor in his kidney. Based on the size and placement, it was determined that the tumor would have caused excruciating pain similar to a kidney stone. Based on that information and the nature of the car accident, they said the man either blacked out from the pain while driving, or had a sharp, sudden pain that caused him to lose control of the vehicle. They had to change the death certificate to add that to the contributory causes. And my aunt also set the curve for the class. And 2 years later, she passed the boards with the top score. While in labor, my cousin was literally born 3-4 hours after my aunt pretty much aced the boards. My mom just informed me she merely passed the boards. My mistake. I'm glad the pre-med students didn't hold her back.